Доброе утро, коллеги.
Good morning, dear colleagues. We are really glad to welcome you all at the Moscow Urban Forum. We carry out it online this time, and our session, our lecture in this morning is devoted to the cities of the future and the most important topic, how pandemic would impact the future of our cities. My name is Ekaterina Shapochkina. I represent the Global Center of the Future Cities of BCG Company, and within this center we are leading a global work on how the future of the cities is shaped, how cities are operated today. And I'd like to introduce to you Vladislav Butenko. Vladislav is responsible in BCG for the global practice of working with cities. Good morning, Vladislav. Good morning, Ekaterina. And just to begin with, I'd like to quote the visionary Nassim Taleb, who said in March, in the beginning of pandemic, that as a result of pandemic, cities will disappear. Vladislav, do you agree with this statement? Ekaterina, first of all, I have great respect to my colleague, to Nassim Taleb. We once took part in one joint event. We were co-authors there. But I do not agree. The cities will not disappear. But again, at the same time, I would agree that the cities will not be the same as they were before. The cities will change. At the same time, they will change, and I recently discussed one of the mayors this topic too. They will change not in response to pandemic, but also because this pandemic will speed up the changes which they planned for. The question is how to change them to be better. We all hope that pandemic will go, of course, sooner or later. But on the other hand, pandemic can and be a catalyst to change what should have been changed before. Just recently, BCG, with the involvement of the Global Future Cities Center, issued an article on how cities will change. And Vladislav, probably you can start telling us about it. And I just wanted to ask you to show us and to start with key issues of pandemic and what are key challenges of the city leaders now have, businesses, population. Please, could you start? Yes, thank you, Ekaterina. I'm pulling up my presentation on the full screen. I hope you can see my screen. So you were absolutely right about the questions. I believe some answers are already there, but right yesterday we had a talk with one of top managers of the company which works in big cities. It's an international company, one of the providers, and they have some statistics on cities. And what I told him, that this top manager should revisit the strategy. He asked me why. We generally now understand what a trend is going to be after COVID, and my answer was Yes, probably you can understand it, but the cities don't. Cities right now are revisiting, and some of them haven't even started to revisit this, and they should think what's going to happen in the future and how should they change. What are key questions there? First, cities were hit by crisis equally or not, where specifically, how specifically they were hit and affected. Very big question is around the compromise set off between the focus on the healthcare and focus on the economy. Unfortunately, some cities had to take very hard decisions in this regard. What was done by cities? What was done good? What were the mistakes? And your question and the question of Nassim Taleb, and we have to pay tribute to him. He answered this question very early in February and March, whether COVID will entail a so-called deurbanization or ruralization, negative growth of cities, what will be the aftermath of crisis all over the world. What will be the difference of countries, of highly developed countries, developing countries, what companies should do in this situation. And of course, we can also speculate. We cannot give you all possible answers, but what the future city will look like. I'm sure it will be different. It will change. The questions about trends now, what trends entail the previous pandemic, what trends will keep, will speed up or recover, how business leaders should look at their operations. Should they stay in big cities? Or some of my colleagues say, let's go to the mid-sized cities, don't go to big cities. Or just consider in general some greenfield projects somewhere in free new areas and build everything from the scratch. I will start with the following. There was recently a global conference in Zoom devoted to the management of a few BCG practices in the world. I will live in Moscow, but I'm dealing with the global cities in different parts of the world. And during this conference, we made a comparison how in this difficult year, some people would say that this is the worst year for the humanity, but I don't think so. But nevertheless, the year is really difficult and hard. What was the behavior of different practices during this year in working with different industries and areas? So if, for example, the finance sphere behaved very well, high tech even won out of the situation, and the sphere of agriculture stayed at the same level, but working with cities, of course, was problematic. Why? Because cities now, we have understand, the cities took the severest impact of pandemic, because pandemic started to develop faster in big cities because the cities are more dense, the density of population is higher, it's obvious, and it led higher spread and faster spread of pandemic. And as we can see in many cities, we see the second wave, whereas in rural areas, when I mention cities, I mean metropolitans, big cities, and in rural areas and small villages, in some of them, well, the second wave haven't even started yet. On the other hand, cities, what is also important, they play a very important role in the economic activities. More than half of the population live in big cities in the world. It's interesting. 200 years ago, in 1810, around this year, there was only 2% of population in the cities. Now 50% of population account for cities, and 80% of the global GDP accounts for big cities. 80%, just imagine. And what we should understand that the topic which the result was hit by cities. So in the cities, it's the situation is harder than in general for the countries. This is one of the most important slides in my presentation. I've already mentioned such tragical and disastrous set of cities had to face, metropolitans of city had to face, had to deal with. I'm not going to say the word compromise, but it's hard to say. This is health, of course, the health of people or economics. This is a trade-off. On the horizontal axis, you see the data as of October 15. We carried out a global survey in the most of big cities in the world. You see on the horizontal axis the figures. These figures show how well cities handled the infection, the total amount of positive cases for 1 million of people. Someone would argue with these figures, but just take a look at this. Per 1 million, how many infected were there at the same date? You can see that some cities in China faced it earlier, other cities later, but in general, we can have a full picture. On the vertical is the expected growth or reduction of GDP. And what is interesting to see here, we have cities with bad situations, like cities in Latin America, Buenos Aires, Lima, Sao Paulo, and also some other regions, Brussels and London. They had it very hard from both sides, from pandemic point of view and economical point of view. What was the mechanism here? It's very easy. It's very easy to understand that if we make a quick and complete lockdown very quickly, and probably the spread will go slower. But since people already understood it, working distantly, and not everybody can work distantly, of course, but anyway, people work worse sitting home other than physically sitting in the offices. And we can discuss it later, what were the reasons of that. But it's obvious. So the question is, shall we close the cities? If we close the cities, people will die less and be ill less, but they will be healthy. But if we don't close, but the economics will then drop down. Peking, Beijing, Shanghai are showed good results, surprisingly enough, in Korea, and Warsaw is also in this quadrant. I don't know why. And there are other cities, like interesting to note. There are cities where there are a lot of positive cases, high morbidity, but not a big impact on economics, like Paris, Riyadh, Tehran. And there are other cities like Washington, which the other way around, the economics is growing faster. There should be Stockholm somewhere. If you look at the median, it's around there in the top left corner. You remember Stockholm, Sweden, they initially said we were not going to do anything. We will wait for the population immunity. But the question probably is what happened with cities which have both bad situation in economics and healthcare, and what are the outcomes. I will cite the example of New York. Around 9 billion deficit of budget. We remember the pictures from March and April, complete lockdown, and when there is lockdown in the States, and not much state support as against Europe or our country. So what happens? Business goes bankrupt. Some restaurants were closing. Like, for example, business don't pay taxes. But New York lives off taxes, and people who live there also live off that. It's very hard now in New York because they should urgently launch new borrowings, and well, in Moscow had it better during pandemic, but also Moscow did this. Then the massive our population in big cities. 110,000 people moved from New York. It's much higher than in 2019, for example. So Nassim was right in some parts. Of course, not all 12 millions wouldn't leave New York, but quite a number of people left the city, and bars and restaurants go bankrupt or close. What is also interesting and important to note that pandemic in general, as often happens unfortunately, is crisis of people. On one hand, poor people and densely living people. In the rural areas, they were not hit severely because the spread is slower there. But here in New York, 20 of 125 severely hit index area account for the districts with low incomes. The city, dense population, and low income. Can I interrupt you, Vladislav, here? Probably a few questions just to clarify. Basically, when we were looking at correlation of density and morbidity, we saw that it's not the average density influences the spread of infection, but so-called crowding is important. The average household size, when the districts are famous for the fact that a lot of people live in one flat, this district is hit more severe by the infection. So in this case, I would even argue, and I would say that the average density as is shouldn't play a role of a unique criteria anyway. Yes, you're right, probably. Yeah, thanks for your comment. You can go deeper and understand what is density. If you build a skyscraper per square meter, if you make a projection of people who live in this skyscraper, the density per square meter will be very high. But it wouldn't mean that it will be a lot of people per square meter of a flat. In New York, we have wonderful buildings around the Central Park, and there's everything's okay. There could be a flat of 200 square meters, very expensive, of course, but only 2 or 3 people live in this flat. Well, this is the case. The crowding, yes, you mentioned crowding. A lot of other things, like rich people, they understood faster than poor people that social distancing is key, and masks and gloves is needed. Now, so-called COVID dissidents is spread all over the world, and very often these are people with low income, and it is correlated with low education. And again, it hit. Yes, and we also notice it. It hits people who communicate a lot, who travel a lot, fly a lot. A lot of governors in Russia had COVID. And then very fast, as it used to be, the pandemic goes down to lower levels. What governments do in this situation? I will move on. Government were lost during some period. Then after 1 or 2 months of this crisis mode, some measures have been designed. First is the support of vulnerable groups of population. Deliveries of food products, like it was in China initially, there was underprivileged group of population received this help. That was for individuals. For local small business, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries, they moved from this baseline, and they say that the liberalism and market should rule, but nevertheless they started to help to support small and medium enterprises, and they may moved away from this statement initially. And in many countries, more in developing countries, the federal governments help cities, as already mentioned previously today. In big cities, especially Anglo-Saxon cities, Anglo-American cities, there was a conflict between normal life of a city, which lives off taxes of individuals, income tax, and property tax, and taxes of small and medium enterprises, which are located in this city. And even in some countries, federal governments, despite that they've never had it before, started to help big cities, started to help and support. We should also notice, yes,
Yes, I wanted to also mention here the fact that this pandemic is a rather unique phenomenon. And it's unique because for the first time in our generation, things which connect people, things which make a city, a living organism, I mean communication, it became the main obstacle for survival of the city. Is it possible to give some examples from history which would show us how can we move on?
Любая пандемия, ну, по крайней
Yes,
мере,
I can give you examples. Any pandemic which we remember about in our history, they lead to the fact that people start thinking a lot. There is a Russian proverb saying that before there is a thunder, Russian peasant guy is not going to cross himself.
так скажем, в сравнении с
And we
компаниями,
know that
которые
cities,
действительно много
they are
работают
different
компаниями по
from
всему миру,
companies.
городами это
They're
не
different
меняется. По двум
organisms, and
причинам.
for
С
them it's
одной
more difficult to
стороны,
change. And there are two reasons for that.
города
On the
крупнее.
one hand,
Ну,
it's
город
more
одна из
difficult to
самых
transform a
сложных
city
систем
because a
в мире,
city
по
it's
крайней
one of
мере,
the
в
most difficult
экономических системах.
economic
Экономика
systems
социальная, да,
in the
гораздо
world.
сложнее, чем компания.
Because city
Потому что
it's just
человек
a
в
more
городе,
complex
язык
phenomenon.
компании, он
At a
работник,
company,
то есть
a
город
human
он и
being
работник,
is a
он
worker, but in a
и
city,
индивидуум,
a
он
human person, a human
целостный,
being, he is a
он
part of a
и
family,
гражданин
he
с
is a
какой-то там
worker, he is
ответственностью и
a
запросом
citizen,
на
and he has a certain
смысл
level of
существования в
responsibility.
городе. Он и потребитель, ну и так
He
далее,
also
да, он
is a
предприниматель.
consumer and
Вот в
so
этой
on,
сложной схеме
entrepreneur.
сложная схема
That's
применения.
why the city is a very
Второе,
difficult system,
очень
very
просто,
complex
в
system.
большинстве городов мира
And the second
изменения,
thing,
чтобы серьезные
any
произошли,
serious
нужно, так скажем, минимум
transformations
10 лет, чтобы серьезно измениться.
require 10 years
Руководство
minimum.
берет
And unfortunately, the management of cities, they are at the helm for 3, 4, sometimes 7 years, very rarely 10 years. That's why it's very difficult to really start major transformations. Just because people who start transformations, they won't see the consequences. And sometimes we need crisis, and we see it in companies as well, to get an impetus to make people think, to make sure that unpopular measures become less unpopular. And many things that we know about from the present example, for example, zoning of the city,
современные системы
or some
канализации
modern
водопровода,
sewage,
это
canalization
зеленые зоны,
systems,
это, в
green
общем-то, то, что мы
zones.
видим много автомобилей, мы
These
сейчас у нас уже
all
ругаемся,
things
вот,
are
но раньше их
very
не было, когда
widespread.
автомобили появились. Это телекоммерция, вот эти все 4 вещи,
Telecommercial
это следствие
systems.
испанки.
So all of these
Испанка,
are
которая
consequences
на памяти
of
человечества
the
унесла 50
Spanish
миллионов жизней, это
flu,
больше всего за
which
всю историю.
took a
Вот не
huge
было
number of
испанки,
lives,
наверное,
which
что-то
was
такое было
the
бы,
biggest,
но было бы,
actually,
может быть, позже,
a
в меньшем
pandemic.
масштабе и, может быть, как-то по-другому.
And I
Как это
think that
работает
it
еще
has
раз?
changed our cities a lot.
Почему телекоммерция? Да потому же, как и сегодня много
Why
доставки
telecommerce
еды,
is the
просто
consequences
потому что люди
of the
поняли,
Spanish flu?
что
Just
ходить в
simply because
магазины
people realize that
опасно.
it's
Испанка, на самом деле,
dangerous to go
всякая
shopping.
болезнь, она
The
такой
Spanish
вирус,
flu,
испанский грипп. На
it's a
самом деле,
terrible
как миллионы
disease.
человек
It's not
умерли от
just the
того,
flu,
часто
not just the
умирали
influenza, but
целыми
people were
деревнями очень быстро.
dying
Вот,
in
это
cohorts. In the whole
недооценивается.
village could die out very
Хуже,
quickly.
чем то, что
It's
происходит
actually
сейчас.
worse than what we see
Ускорение
with the
автомобилизации,
COVID.
люди
People
боялись
started
выходить на
seeing
улицы,
getting more
соответственно,
cars because
больше
people were
проблем в
afraid
первой
to
теме
go
автомобилей.
abroad in the
Зеленые
streets.
зоны,
They were
очевидно,
thinking about buying a
и
car.
жилищные ресурсы.
Green
Сегодня
zones,
это
yes,
не
it's
очень
understandable as
рекомендуемо,
well.
как было
Why
в
people
Париже.
started thinking about
Вот,
greenery more.
многие из нас
Another
живут
example from Paris. You
вот,
know this
видим
city, probably
фотографии
you've been to
красивых
Paris
парижских
or
бульваров.
you've seen these
Вот,
beautiful
квартал
Paris boulevards, for example, Haussmann Boulevard
другие
or
бульвары, да?
Champs-Élysées.
Вот, они же не всегда были в Париже.
They were not always there, these beautiful
И как
boulevards.
все произошло,
How did they come about? Why do we have these beautiful streets in
Наполеон
Paris right
III,
now?
1850
Napoleon
году,
III
да, вы же помните,
in
что
1850, in the year 1850, yes, we do
было
remember that in
восстановление
France,
империи, да,
there was a restoration of the empire
после революции.
after
Наполеон
several
III
decades after the
сказал,
revolution, and Napoleon
что
III
Париж
said
должен
that
измениться.
Paris
Почему Париж
should
должен измениться?
change.
Потому что
Why did he say that?
в Париже было, ну, в
In
общем, стало
Paris,
невозможно жить,
it
потому
was
что
not
плотная застройка,
possible to live
плотная, как
anymore. There were
многие сказали,
the
скученная,
buildings
привела к тому,
were located
что
too
любая
closely to each other.
пандемия,
Too many
она
people
очень
were
быстро
living there.
распространялась, там
And
была
every
холера,
pandemic was
чума,
spreading
туберкулез
very
и другие
fast.
болезни. Вот. Ам, д-
The
Трудно
plague,
в это
tuberculosis and other diseases was spreading very fast. And it's difficult to believe that, but people still were pouring their dirty waters outside in the streets. So it was just dangerous to live there. And rich people started to leave the city. They were going to the south west of the city, which is now the 16th arrondissement in Paris, and it was the city started losing money. Then Napoleon III asked the new governor of the Seine region to have the land reform. They've created a plan, the plan for boulevards, and just in 10 years, the city has changed. They ousted people, they've created this wider streets, and Haussmann, who was the head of this program, he became very unpopular in the city. He lost his job eventually, and we see that he did a very great thing as we assess it now, but the process itself was extremely challenging. We have just 4 minutes left. Please tell me, what is going to happen with the city after the pandemic? What's your vision? As I've said already, of course, we do not have a very clear, unanimous answer, but the cities which have solved some problems in medicine or are trying to overcome the economic shock, now the cities are thinking about some new plans. And I'll share with you what I know. For example, an inclusive city. That's one of the ideas. You see here on the slide information about the mutual access to all the services. The pandemic made us thinking about building more affordable houses with a good standard of living. Infrastructure which is sustainable to external shocks. Here I do not have a very clear answer. When there was a serious crisis, people started thinking about other possible crises. What if we see a very serious climate change, for example, in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia? Right now, on average in August, the maximum temperature is up to 50 degrees. And in 2 years, we can see the maximum temperature of 55 degrees. Can you imagine what's that if you are in a city? It's just the temperature doesn't let you get out in the street. Suburbs. It's another very important topic, including suburbs. Not always people prefer to live in the city center because suburbs are usually greener, cleaner, and so on. And many people started thinking of not coming for work in the city, like many of us are doing right now. What shall we change from the technological point of view, connectivity, from the point of view of the business processes at companies and sizes of our apartments? All of us during the pandemic realized that our apartments were too small. It's not possible for us to be in our apartments together with our children for longer periods of time. Public spaces, making better public spaces, yes, that's true. Multifunctionality for public spaces. In Paris, there is a concept of 15-minute city. According to this concept, everything you need should be just in a walking distance from your home. In 15 minutes, you should be able to reach your office, school, grocery store, restaurant, cinema, and so on. Cities should be like small towns in themselves. Districts should become like small towns. We have to finish this session. We would like to thank you for your lecture. It was interesting to talk about the history and the future. It's very important to also think about interest of all stakeholders, those who live in the city, and we need to think about some win-win possible situations. We need to make sure that everyone is happy in the city and everyone wants to stay and live in the city. Thank you very much. I do hope that cities will survive, but they will change. They will transform. If there are any questions, if you send them to me, I'll be happy to answer.